Thank you, everyone, for dialing in. My name is Doug Vine. I'm a Senior Energy Fellow at C2ES. Thanks for dialing in and making time for our webinar today. We had around 300 people register for this webinar, so we know there's a lot of interest in pricing externalities and attributes in wholesale power markets. Before we dive into the content of today's webinar, let me just take care of a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our C2ES YouTube page. And because we have so many participants, we're going to use the GoToWebinar chat box for questions. You can submit your questions online and I'll raise them for our panelists during the moderated discussion. You'll also see in the handout section of the control panel that we've attached some papers for you to download and review at your convenience. Today we're going to start with some quick scene setting on wholesale power markets, externalities, and other attributes, which have been proposed for inclusion in these power markets. Then I'll introduce the panelists. Ari Pesco will give us an overview of FERC's authority to price carbon. Next, Bill Berg will give us nuclear energy's perspective in these markets. Then Sam Newell will talk to us about New York's clean energy efforts and some analysis that he worked on. Finally, Kristin Munsch will give us an update on Illinois and PJM. Then I will lead our discussion session by asking the panelists a few questions, and then we'll take a few audience questions as well. With that, let me begin by saying a few words about C2ES. So C2ES is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. Our core mission is to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. We are known as a convener of stakeholders, and we produce a lot of publications on energy, climate, and resilience as well. One of our unique features is that we have a Business Environment Leadership Council. As you can see on this slide here, it includes top companies in the electric power, manufacturing, transportation, high-tech, oil and gas, and finance sectors. It's one of the largest US-based group of companies devoted solely to addressing climate change. One of the benefits of the BELC is that it's multi-sectoral, so unlike a trade association, companies can talk to other companies outside of their industry on climate policy. We have a program called the Solutions Forum at C2ES in which we bring together businesses, states, and city leaders to develop practical climate solutions. Through public-private roundtables and webinars like this one, we focus on employing market-based strategies to reduce carbon emissions, mobilizing innovative climate finance for clean energy, efficiency, and climate-related efforts, and strengthening communities' climate resilience. We want to thank our generous sponsor, the JPB Foundation, for making today's conversation possible. And you can read more about C2ES and the Solutions Forum on our brand new website at c2es.org, as well as read all of the reports. Now let's dive into the focus of today's webinar, which is pricing externalities in wholesale power markets. First, I think it would be useful for some scene setting to briefly describe what wholesale power markets are. Wholesale markets typically involve the sales of electricity among electric utilities and electricity traders before it's eventually sold to consumers. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, has jurisdiction over the wholesale markets. Independent system operators, or ISOs, or regional transmission operators, RTOs, run the day-to-day operations of these markets and do longer-term planning as well. This map is from the FERC website, and it shows the markets across the US, in California and New York, as well as the PJM RTO, which encompasses all or part of 13 states and the District of Columbia. And what do wholesale power markets do? Primarily, they were designed to create competition, but they do other things as well. In the interest of time, let's just say that opening up the transmission system to all generators in a particular area and allowing the participants to bid supply offers into the market has created real competition and lowered prices in the wholesale markets. Our panelists today will talk more about actions in the New York ISO and PJM markets and wholesale power markets in general. What is an externality? Well, it's an economics term, and in general, an externality is the consequence or result of some activity, in our case, electricity production, which is experienced by an unrelated third party. This result can be beneficial, or it can have a cost. Pollution is the most well-known negative externality of economic production, be it from industry or from electricity production. Today, our panelists will explore the concept of internalizing the cost of carbon pollution in wholesale power markets. Reliability and resilience are other electric system attributes that are getting a lot of attention recently. Reliability is a well-defined concept. Definitions and standards exist. NERC focuses almost exclusively on this issue. Resilience is a much less developed concept, particularly with regard to wholesale power markets. The recent DOE notice of proposed rulemaking makes an attempt to open the resilience discussion and establish just and reasonable rate tariffs for certain fuel-resilient generation units. Can market mechanisms be used to meet reliability and resilience policy objectives? Are markets adequately planning for the future that we want? We'll look at these questions in more detail. One paper that I want to just point out that we are not going to discuss among the panelists, but it's some work that C2ES has done with regard to carbon capture. So at C2ES and in the literature around deep decarbonization goals by mid-century, most of the studies, most of the literature suggests that a power system with a diverse mix of renewables, nuclear power, and fossil fuel with carbon capture, utilization, and storage is going to be the least cost and least technologically challenging pathway to achieve that mid-century goal. So with that in mind, I wanted to quickly draw your attention to some work C2ES has done on incorporating carbon capture in wholesale power markets. 14 states outlined on this slide, industry stakeholders and NGOs, including C2ES, convened a working group in 2015 on CO2 EOR, which is carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, which is a form of carbon capture, use, and storage. In June, the work group released a white paper laying out steps for integration and dispatch of carbon capture in wholesale electricity markets. The paper highlights policies that could support all low and zero carbon generation options. And I invite you to download that paper and the other papers in the handout section of the webinar on the control panel, which should have come up on the right of your screen. So now I'm going to give a quick introduction of our speakers. First, our first speaker will be Ari Pesco. He's the Senior Law Fellow in Electricity Law at the Harvard Law School Environmental Law Program Policy Initiative. He's written extensively about electricity regulation on issues ranging from electric vehicles to constitutional challenges to states' energy laws. Prior to the policy initiative, Ari was an associate at a law firm in Washington, D.C., where he litigated before the Berg. Bill Berg is Exelon Corporation Vice President of Wholesale Market Development. Bill manages Exelon's wholesale policy development and advocacy in all competitive wholesale markets in which Exelon is engaged to ensure outcomes that are aligned with Exelon's business strategy. Mr. Berg works closely with various business units within Exelon to understand the business needs of the corporation. Mr. Berg has worked in the electric power sector for 23 years, and in that time developed an understanding of market dynamics in regulated and deregulated electricity markets. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sam Newell. He's a principal with the Brattle Group. Dr. Newell is an expert in electricity wholesale markets, market design, generation asset valuation, integrated resource planning, and transmission planning. He supports clients throughout the United States in regulatory litigation and business strategy matters. He frequently provides testimony and expert reports to ISOs and the FERC state regulatory commissions, and the American Arbitration Association. And our final speaker will be Kristin Munsch. She's the Deputy Director for the Illinois Citizens Utility Board, a nonprofit consumer advocacy group that represents the interests of residential and small business utility customers through outreach, education, litigation, and policy advocacy. She's appeared before the Illinois Commerce Commission and the FERC regarding utility rate issues, electricity supply, and distributed energy resource planning, procurement, and regulation, with a particular focus on the use of new technologies to benefit utility customers. So with that, Ari, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Doug, for inviting me to participate, and thank you, everyone, for joining. So I'm going to tackle the legal issues around carbon prices and wholesale power markets. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, governs and regulates wholesale power markets, and FERC operates within the confines of legal authority provided by Congress. So there's a couple outstanding legal questions about carbon adders that I'm going to try to tackle here. So next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk about what the process is for FERC approving a carbon adder. How does this actually get implemented? And there's a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach that I'm going to touch on. The second issue is, well, does FERC even have any legal authority at all to approve an RTO tariff? That's the Regional Transmission Organization tariff that has a carbon adder in it. It's not, this is sort of there are no real answers yet to this question. Ultimately, this is likely to be decided by a federal court if it ever reaches that stage. But I'll give you my take on this question. And then the final question is, okay, well, if it's within the scope of FERC's legal authority, it has to then be just and reasonable. Those are the key words under federal law. All wholesale power rates have to be just and reasonable. So what does that mean in the context of a carbon price? And so I'm just going to touch on these issues briefly. There's a lot more on this in the paper that's posted in the handouts. It goes into some excruciating legal detail on these questions. Next slide, please. So this is another version of the map that Doug showed, but what this highlights here is the RTO or ISO markets. These are these regional electricity markets that operate auction markets to dispatch generators. These auction markets are governed by their tariffs, and FERC ultimately has to approve all market rules before they're implemented. So in the other parts of the country, with the exception of Texas, FERC does have authority over wholesale transactions, but it's more, it's of a different nature because these don't have these organized, centralized wholesale markets. So when I talk about FERC authority to implement a carbon price, I'm really focusing on these regions of the country and through FERC's regulation of their market rules. Next slide, please. So FERC gets its authority from Congress, which enacted the Federal Power Act in 1935. And the core provisions of this law are largely unchanged. I've just highlighted a few of the important sections here. Section 201 of the Federal Power Act provides FERC with its jurisdiction over wholesale sales of electricity in interstate commerce. So that's what we're talking about here. Wholesale sales means just a sale for resale. That's when a generator sells to a utility who in turn sells to a consumer. So that sale from the generator to the utility, or in this case, the generator to an RTO, those are FERC-regulated transactions. Sections 205 and 206, those require that all rates for wholesale sales be just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on what just and reasonable means in the context of a carbon price. It's important to point out here that there's nothing in the Federal Power Act that talks about pollution, right? There's another federal agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, that has very clear authority to regulate pollution. And that's typically, FERC really has not addressed pollution issues. It's sort of, it hasn't said definitively that it's beyond its control, but really FERC is a market regulator. FERC is an economic and technical regulator, not a pollution regulator. So there's really this outstanding question of how could we include a carbon price in in an RTO tariff if the purpose of that carbon price is to regulate pollution? Is that something that EPA should be doing and not something that FERC should be doing? So I argue that FERC does have legal authority to do it, but it has to be within the confines of the authorization provided by Congress. So I'm going to go into that now in the next slide as to what that means. So there's basically two ways of how this carbon price could be implemented in an RTO tariff. The first one is the bottom-up approach. And that's where an RTO itself, whether it's PJM, ISO New England, New York ISO, or one of the others, submits a proposal to FERC for its approval and says, we have some reason for wanting to include a carbon price in our tariff. Please, FERC, approve this. So that's sort of the bottom-up approach. It has to come from the RTO itself, and each RTO has its own stakeholder process for how it would put together a proposal for FERC's approval. The second possibility is that it's a top-down approach, where FERC makes a determination that there's a problem with current rates and current rules, that current rates are unjust and unreasonable because they are not including a carbon price. And then FERC also has to conclude that including a carbon price will then result in just and reasonable rates, and then it would require the RTOs to adopt a carbon adder. This is a much more complicated path. It requires FERC to really do the heavy lifting in making all these findings. The easier path forward is really the bottom-up approach, where it has to come from the market participants, from the RTOs, where they make the case to FERC as to why an RTO, or why a carbon adder is necessary for just and reasonable rates. So what might that case look like from an RTO? Before we get there, though, is this even within the scope of FERC's authority to do this? As I mentioned, the Federal Power Act is an 80-year-old law. It didn't contemplate a carbon adder, so is this something that might fit within the confines of FERC's authority? Next slide, please. You know, when Congress enacted the Federal Power Act in 1935, the electric industry was really governed through cost of service rates. That's where the regulator looked at the costs that the utility incurred to construct its power plants, its operational costs, fuel costs, and it provided the utility with a rate that was going to recover those costs and provide it with a rate of return on its capital investments. So that cost of service regulatory framework looks very different from today's market-based construct. And a series of reforms in the 1980s and the 1990s, FERC used that, the same legal authority that it's had since 1935 to facilitate the creation of today's wholesale markets. And here on this slide, I've just listed some of those reforms. I'm not going to go into each one of them here. The point here is just to say FERC accomplished a lot, dramatically altered the structure of the industry using its 80-year-old statutory authority. And really the focus of these FERC reforms was really to remedy discriminatory practices, remedy the monopolization that the utilities had on the transmission grid by opening it up to competition, and then determining that the auction structure that RTOs use was sort of a platform for competition that was going to itself result in just and reasonable rates. So FERC, again, used this 80-year-old authority to dramatically reform the industry. And so it's done a lot with this authority, and so it is given that it created these markets with this 80-year-old law, I think it stands to reason that it can reform those markets as well within this legal framework. Next slide, please. So there are some limiting principles to what FERC can do, and the key principle is this first bullet here. This is a quote from a recent Supreme Court decision. The case was about FERC's authority over demand response resources, which are resources that decrease their consumption in response to price signals from the market. And FERC said that, the Supreme Court said that FERC's justifications for market reform must be all about and only about improving the wholesale markets. So I think that lesson applies to carbon pricing. Carbon pricing in RTO markets must be about improving the wholesale market. It's not regulating pollution for the sake of improving the quality of our environment. That's something that really EPA needs to handle. But if there's a case to be made that a carbon adder, for whatever reason, improves the functioning of the wholesale market, then it is within FERC's authority to approve market rules that have a carbon adder. And the second point here is just that you know, the law itself, the Federal Power Act itself, is silent on this issue. There's nothing clearly in the Federal Power Act that would prohibit FERC from approving a carbon adder. So given the complexity of FERC's responsibilities to regulate these highly technical markets, courts would typically defer to FERC's judgment if it determines that a carbon adder were necessary for improving the wholesale market. Next slide, please. But that only says that FERC has authority to approve a wholesale market, to approve a carbon adder. There's also an empirical case to be made that a carbon adder actually improves the wholesale market. So what might that mean? Well, a carbon adder would have to be found to be just and reasonable. And the Supreme Court over the years has said that just and reasonable rates balance the consumer and investor interests. Those are back in the cost of service days, where rates couldn't be too high so as to harm consumers, but also couldn't be so low so as to harm investors and utilities. But more recently, the court has said that just and reasonable rates enhance competition. And so that's sort of what just and reasonable rates means in the context of a market. That market rules that are designed to enhance competition are necessarily just and reasonable. So is there a case to be made that the carbon adder will in some way enhance competition in the market? And then the third point is that just and reasonable rates are consistent with the Federal Power Act's principal purpose of promoting the orderly development of the industry. Again, is there an empirical case to be made, you know, based on analysis of market trends, that a carbon adder will, you know, contribute to the orderly development of the electricity industry? So these are sort of this sort of provides the framework for an analysis of how you might think about whether a carbon adder is just and reasonable. Next slide, please. And so, you know, when FERC thinks about whether a rate is just and reasonable, the Supreme Court has also said that FERC is authorized to consider the consequences of all utility practices that affect rates. And in my mind, the best case for a carbon adder is that there are an array of state policies that are requiring utilities to purchase renewable energy, in some cases account for their carbon emissions, or rather requiring generators to account for their carbon emissions through RGGI and other policies. Is a carbon adder a mechanism for rationalizing all of these policies, for somehow bringing them together? Again, this is an empirical case to be made, not one that I'm going to answer right now, but it's within the scope of FERC's authority to consider these state policies, to consider the fact that utilities and generators incur real costs in complying with these state policies, and to think about how a carbon adder might be a mechanism for enhancing competition and ensuring the orderly development of the industry. So again, I have a paper where I go into some additional detail, making this case that state policies that require renewable energy and account for carbon are an impetus for FERC to consider and ultimately approve a carbon adder in wholesale markets. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Ari. That was great. Providing us the legal justification, some really interesting points, and I see some interesting questions coming in as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Berg from Exelon, and he's going to talk about Exelon's role in the wholesale power markets.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you all for joining this webinar today. Just take a moment to talk about Exelon. Exelon is a very large integrated utility. Integrated utility, the way I would define that is we have operations, all of our operations actually, are in the regional competitive markets that Ari described earlier. We have 6 utilities that are all located in PJM, and our utilities own no generation. Their purpose is to manage the distribution of transmission power and to use the wholesale market to procure the energy for their customers. We also own generation. We're a very large generation provider. Our generation is spread throughout the country. We have 32,700 megawatts of generation. And of that 32,000 megawatts, 22,000 megawatts is nuclear power. Exelon Nuclear is by far the largest division of Exelon Generation. We do operate the largest fleet of nuclear plants in America. We have 23 different nuclear reactors that are clean, zero carbon, and always on. We are very proud of our nuclear fleet, and we believe that they provide an ideal foundation for the clean energy future that we are all moving towards. Couple last statistics on this slide. Our nuclear generation allows us to be the #1 zero carbon energy provider in America. And of the 205 terawatt hours of customer load that we serve, 164 terawatt hours come from nuclear power. So that's emission free. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about nuclear these days? And I thought it would be helpful to kind of start with just a brief slide talking about cost versus revenues. On the left-hand side of the chart, you can see average 2016 nuclear cost in dollars per megawatt hour, and you can kind of see the buildup of those costs. You can see that there is a substantial cost savings between the dual units versus the single units. And with the dual units, you have a cost of anywhere between $32 to $39 a megawatt hour, and the single unit nuclear reactors have the higher cost of anywhere between $41 and $50. So those are the costs, the average cost in 2016, and then you compare cost to revenues. And so on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see, and we picked 2020. Which is kind of a visible marketplace. And we picked a date and we just found the prices, and we compared those prices throughout the different organized competitive markets within the country. So you can see there that the revenues that nuclear units can expect to receive vary from anywhere from a low of $26 in upstate New York to, I guess, a high of $46 in New England. When you compare those costs to the revenues, you can see that in today's environment, and even looking forward a little bit, the economics of nuclear with the markets we have defined today, which do not include the attribute or externality that we're talking about today, are facing significant financial challenges. So this is why the conversation about attributes and unpriced externalities is very timely, important, and should continue. There's one more note I wanted to kind of impart with you on this slide, and it has to do with the market revenues that nuclear units can receive. There's two colors. There's the green, which represents energy revenues that a nuclear plant would expect to receive, and the yellow is the capacity revenues that the units could receive, to the extent there's a capacity market in the organized market. And what you can see here is that nuclear units, because of their always-on characteristics, rely much more heavy on the energy market revenues versus the capacity market revenues. Within the wholesale markets, we have spent at least the last decade talking about capacity markets. And we at Exelon believe that the time is we've improved the capacity markets, but it is really time to start thinking about the energy markets and how they can perform, both in terms of providing market revenues as the markets exist today, as well as adding externalities. Next slide, please. Okay. As you might suspect, Exelon is a huge supporter of carbon policy. We think it is essential and necessary, and we have been working in multiple forums for many years trying to find a way to incorporate the carbon pollution externality into the wholesale markets. So we have two big principles that we've put forth. The first is we believe that nuclear is absolutely part of the transition of the generation fleet to the zero carbon future. Not only do these resources provide zero carbon emissions, but they are extremely reliable and cost effective for our customers. And so as we look out into the near-term future, we believe and have demonstrated in certain areas that the most cost-effective solution, carbon solution for customers, is to maintain continued operation of our nation's nuclear fleet. We believe that competitive markets can and have provided superior results for our consumers, but as we've talked about, the markets today, as they're structured, do not currently incorporate the appropriate pricing for environmental attributes. And if you recollect to the previous slide on energy revenues, if you put a price on carbon, it will show up in the energy market, and it will improve the revenues that these resources receive in a favorable way. So what are we doing? It's really a two-part strategy. First, we believe that you have to maintain the nuclear units. We are advocating at the state, national, as well as the RTO level that we need to find a way to save these resources. We have had success in Illinois and New York in terms of a state program, a zero emission credit program, which rewards the nuclear units for the cost-effective carbon they provide. Second, we have to continue the debate on the national debate, really, or the RTO regional debate, as to how can we incorporate a technology-neutral price into the wholesale market and capture those benefits. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So now you kind of shift a little bit. There are a lot of things going on. The Department of Energy Notice of Proposed Rulemaking came out, and it was discussed earlier, and it created a lot of conversation. FERC has opened a docket to consider the NOPR, and we believe at Exelon that, again, like carbon, there's a missing attribute in the wholesale markets today that needs to be considered, and it is we as a country are increasingly reliable on natural gas and renewables, and we have yet to consider as an industry the resilience or the strength of the grid to recover from either natural or man-made disruptions. That is not in the wholesale market rules today, and we think it needs to be considered. We do believe that this is going to take longer than 60 days. And on my last slide here, I will kind of articulate the path forward that Exelon has put forth on that. This is the issue for the DOE NOPR as we see it. There's another kind of PJM specific issue that has popped up, which is related, and it has to do with energy price formation. PJM has been developing market rules, reforms to its energy markets that would allow all resources to set price. Over the past few years, FERC has been engaging in a dialogue on energy price formation, and one of the issues they've been wrestling with has been how do we let inflexible units that are needed to serve load set price. They're set the locational clearing price. And the focus to date has been primarily on the quick start peaker resources that are out there. They're generally on-off machines, and so when you turn them on, they're deemed inflexible for purposes of setting price, and they're not able to set price. We have seen, and it's regional in nature, but in PJM in particular, we've seen situations where it's not a turn on a peaker situation in times of increasing demand. You're seeing large inflexible units such as nuclear units and very large other base load resources. They are needed to serve load. They are on. They have reduced their output as much as possible, so now they're deemed inflexible, and they're ineligible to set price. While this is not designed to address resilience, getting after this particular flaw in the energy market would help nuclear units, which we believe are resilient, because it would improve energy price formation. And if you go back to that cost and revenue slide and imagine the green bar, this would help kind of the cost and revenues situation for nuclear that they're facing today. Next slide, please. And here's the slide that we have been sharing, and we're trying to break down price formation versus resiliency. You know, and we've kind of listed the problem that PJM's price formation proposal, as well as the DOE resiliency NOPR was seeking to address, and to first define the problem, define the solution, and you know, the solution under the price formation is to allow large and flexible baseload units that have already ramped down as far as they can to be able to set the market clearing price. With respect to DOE, we think there's a process that needs to be started. There's more information, and the conversation is needed to kind of define what is resilience, and we've suggested a process forward. So I'll let you can read this material. I won't read it all to you. Next slide, please. And just in closing, this is kind of a summary slide of the comments Exelon filed at FERC. We kind of broke our comments up into, for the DOE NOPR, we broke our comments up into kind of short-term actions as well as intermediate, longer-term comprehensive measures. The short term, we think FERC needs to correct the energy pricing flaws that we see today. And we also think that FERC should avoid interfering with state programs such as the ZEC, which have the effect of preserving existing nuclear units. There's, and I think Kristin's going to talk about this later, there's a lot of debate within the wholesale market community as to, well, if a state has an RPS or grants a ZEC program, is it receiving an out-of-market subsidy in the wholesale market such that it's distorting wholesale market outcomes? We don't believe that's the case, but others disagree with us, and there are issues pending at FERC today dealing with that issue. And longer term, more intermediate, we really need to get our arms around as an industry what do we mean by resilience. And the path that we've put forward begins with the RTOs and ISOs submitting information to FERC, kind of assessing what they have and do not have in their grid today, and looking at the susceptibility of fuel supply interruption. And if that was to happen, what is the RTO's ability to recover from and continue to serve load? The second point is we need to work with the relevant agencies to establish kind of a design basis threat. What should we be planning for when we are, what should we incorporate into the market and incorporate into the planning standard such that if one of these natural or man-made disasters happens, what should we be prepared to respond to? And the second one is very important because once you've kind of designed what you're solving for, the design basis threat, you can then determine what specific reforms are necessary to address the resilience attributes we're talking about now. So with that, that concludes my remarks, and I look forward to the questions and discussion later.
Thanks, Bill. I think your cost and revenue slide certainly really laid out the issue or the challenge that nuclear is facing, and we definitely want to keep making forward progress on emissions reductions. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Sam Newell from the Brattle Group. Sam, take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Doug, and nice to be with all of you. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the initiative in New York to decarbonize and to consider implementing carbon pricing beyond what is already there through RGGI. The starting point you need to know first is that New York has already done the big policy lift towards decarbonization, and that's to establish decarbonization goals and a mandate to achieve those goals. The goal is to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gases by 40% by 2030 and by 80% by 2050. So very big goals. And also achieve a 50% reduction in the electricity sector by 2030. And then the mandate is to procure RECs from renewable resources and ZECs from upstate nuclear plants to help meet those goals. And New York has other policies too, including membership in RGGI, energy efficiency programs, and others. Now, the question that New York ISO is pursuing, and now the state regulators as well, is whether these decarbonization goals can be met more efficiently and in better harmony with the wholesale electricity markets if existing mechanisms are supplemented by carbon pricing. And I mean carbon pricing at a higher level than RGGI, in line with New York's ambitious goals. And New York ISO asked the Brattle Group to help evaluate the options for carbon pricing. Next slide, please. So here's the attraction of introducing carbon pricing to align wholesale markets and state policy objectives. First, putting a uniform, and this is an old idea that economists have been talking about for a long time, put a uniform price in the market that allows all technologies to compete, and rewarding those that can displace carbon-emitting generation at least cost. This will find cost-effective carbon abatement opportunities more than just strictly targeted policies will, such as the RECs and ZECs. And so examples of efficiencies, cost-effective abatement opportunities that can emerge with a carbon price in the market is rewarding greater fuel efficiency in the fossil fleet, so shifting the dispatch as well as investment and retirement decisions toward lower carbon. So that means plant upgrades, it means CCs instead of peakers, and a more efficient dispatch. The carbon pricing can provide a more granular price signal for where there's a lot of carbon on the margin that can be avoided, so that can improve the siting decisions for new renewable resources to places that will displace the most carbon. And then the carbon price will also help reward energy efficiency and conservation and storage that can shift net load away from peak hours with high emitting generation at the margin, which is when a carbon adder would increase prices the most. And then there's a second and more subtle but also important reason to really bring in carbon pricing. It's to keep the markets and the policies from undermining each other, particularly with RECs and ZECs lowering energy market prices and therefore penalizing resources that are fairly clean but don't qualify for RECs and ZECs. That can interfere with both energy and environmental objectives. And to put it simply, markets and environmental policies work more effectively when externalities are incorporated into markets, like we did for NOx and SOx, and that worked so well. Next slide, please. And there are a number of good ways to introduce carbon pricing with various advantages and disadvantages. We focused on a carbon charge. This is the same mechanism that Ari described a little while ago as a carbon adder. It's similar to a tax, but instead of being administered by a tax authority, the ISO could incorporate carbon charges directly into the dispatch and settlement and charging generators, and this raises the energy price, the LMP, and then return the collected charges to customers. Next slide, please. We estimated the impact that a $40 per ton of CO2 charge added to the market in 2025 as a one-year snapshot, what the impacts would be compared to the status quo. And the status quo does have the RECs and ZECs. It has the targeted programs and a modest RGGI price. So we're not comparing it to a world with no decarbonization. We're comparing it to a world that does not have this carbon pricing mechanism at this level. And what we estimated is that a $40 per ton charge could reduce annual CO2 emissions by an additional 2.5 million tons, about a 9% reduction of in-state emissions. And these, or those reductions could replace costlier abatement measures, such as buying more RECs, because the market finds other low-cost abatement measures. So you can buy fewer RECs and achieve the same emissions and save about $120 million a year. That is a reduction in total economic costs to serve load and to meet environmental objectives. And not surprisingly, market mechanism finds a lower cost solution. And then the big question, though, is, okay, that increases efficiency and or reduces emissions, but does putting a carbon price in the market increase costs to consumers? That question has really been one of the biggest barriers to introducing a carbon price. And so we did a fair amount of analysis to address that. And what we found is that customer costs would not rise materially. They could go down by as much as 1/10 of a cent a kilowatt hour. They could go up by as much as about 1/2 a cent a kilowatt hour, depending on a lot of uncertainties, market conditions, and implementation choices. So why is there so little impact on the customers? If you can go to the next slide, please. This chart shows that a $40 per ton carbon price would raise wholesale energy prices by about $20 a megawatt hour, or 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And that makes sense because the the marginal price setting unit in New York on average is a gas-fired unit, usually with about close to 1/2 a ton of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour. So $40 translate 1/2 a ton, $20 a megawatt hour. But that is not the whole story. That is not the impact on customers. That's just the starting point. About half of that impact would be offset by returning the carbon fund to customers. Remember, you're charging emitters. They get the higher LMP, but they are charged for their emissions, and then you return those charges to customers. And again, that offsets about half of the customer impact. And then there are many other offsetting effects. The market price for RECs and ZEC prices would decrease due to the higher wholesale energy prices. And finally, that $20 a megawatt hour I mentioned was based on a static analysis. In fact, the market would respond to a carbon price operating an investment differently. Market response will always reduce static estimates of price impacts, and that's shown by the blue bar, which was part of what we did was to estimate that effect. And then finally, the resulting impact on customer bills, our base case was only 0.17 cents a kilowatt hour increase. And the range shown by the gray shaded bar shows that depending on a lot of uncertainties we looked at, it could be, again, anywhere from a slight decrease to a slightly larger increase than that. And if you could go to the next slide, please. I won't go through the details, but there are a broad range of uncertainties we analyzed. And in all cases, there was a fairly small net impact on customer bills relative to having no carbon charge. And finally, if you could go to the last slide, please. Our report helped kick off an initiative between New York ISO, the New York Department of Public Service, or the Public Service Commission, and stakeholders in New York. And what's exciting is that the idea of pricing externalities is something we've talked about for a long time, but the state is actually contemplating this idea that we've been talking about for so long, and beyond the fairly low price that we see in RGGI. So the next steps are for New York ISO through stakeholder meetings, as well as the DPS with stakeholder technical conferences, to first, overall, to further develop a proposal on whether and how to implement carbon pricing in wholesale energy markets. And second, to address some of the key market design questions. Two of the big ones are how to allocate the carbon revenues among load-serving entities and ultimately customers. And another big one is how to prevent leakage across the seam. A big challenge with any form of carbon pricing, whether it's through a carbon adder or cap and trade, is that you're basically putting higher costs on the affected in-state generators you're disadvantaging them relative to their competitors that are not facing a carbon price. And so you can imagine that imports would come flooding in. There's a similar effect with arresting exports too. But that what that can result in is a distorted dispatch, and you're not actually reducing emissions. You're just pushing them out of state. And that would run counter to all the objectives. So it's really important to have appropriate border charges, border adjustments. So those are some of the issues that will be addressed in the coming months, and stay tuned.
Thank you, Sam. I'm struck by carbon pricing is an old idea, of course, but the idea of incorporating it in power markets, and certainly the case study of New York ISO is a very compelling one in terms of what its effects and costs would be. Of course, with the caveat that you added at the end about controlling for leakage and some other factors. So our last speaker on the panel is Kristin Munsch. She's the Deputy Director of the Citizens Utility Board, and she's going to be talking about some of the things that are going on in Illinois and in PJM.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I think this is, as people have said, a really timely discussion for a lot of reasons. And I think from the Illinois perspective, it's something that we're sort of intrigued. It's taken years to develop, and so we're going to be very interested to see how we move forward. Next slide, please. I want to give just a little bit of background about CUB. As was mentioned before, we're a nonprofit created to represent the interests of utility consumers, particularly residential and small business. I do think that it's interesting to note the role of consumer advocates. Traditionally, consumer advocates have been focused on the bottom line, on the bills for customers. We actually are a membership organization, and our members are starting to express preferences for environmental and clean technology policies, as well as focusing on the bottom line. So I think the role of consumer advocates is beginning to change, and the questions are getting a little more complicated as we have this sort of collision of environmental and economic interests for us. There are consumer advocates in all the states within MISO and PJM. In PJM, there are 14 consumer advocate offices. A little bit of background on Illinois. We are a deregulated state. We created what you see there, the Illinois Power Agency, in 2007. The IPA is charged with procuring energy and capacity on behalf of those customers who do not choose to go with an alternative supplier. They are actually also the people who are doing the procurement for the zero emission credits. We have a renewable portfolio standard. It has been in place since 2007 as well. And we are members, our downstate utility, Ameren, which is a member of MISO, and then Commonwealth Edison, which is a subsidiary of Exelon, which is a member of PJM. And one of the interesting things I want to talk about is kind of the boots on the ground perspective of working through at the wholesale market level some of these questions around state policies, pricing externalities, and market responses. CUB became involved with PJM and MISO around the same time we deregulated, as we started to notice that increasingly our customer bills were made up, largest costs were the energy and capacity. At one point it went as high as 70% of the customer bill was actually on the deregulated side. Now it's gone down a little bit. The other thing we noticed was, again, this expression of resource preferences from our members, and we were seeing it expressed in municipal aggregation products around the state, where municipal aggregation contracts were focusing on green power. As was, I think someone mentioned before, both PJM and MISO have a stakeholder process. PJM is very involved. It is a lot of committees and task forces, and one of the challenges in it, I think, for those of us that want to see carbon pricing or the inclusion of externalities in wholesale markets is how the sectors are set up and how the sectors are weighted. There are 5 sectors in PJM. Most of the clean energy technology, demand response, and efficiency providers are in the other supplier sectors. The other sectors are the end-use customer, which CUB is a part of, generation owners, transmission owners, and then the electric delivery company sector. Next slide, please. Illinois has been an experimenter and I think an innovator in clean energy for a while. I'm not sure if the slide has moved or, there we go, thank you. And the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was passed in 2016 and became effective on June 1st of this year, is the next step in what we are attempting to do. We have an emphasis on efficiency. We have a performance-based energy efficiency standard. We have improved our funding for our renewable portfolio standard, and we have a zero emission standard. The zero emission standard is going to be procured by the IPA. The initial procurement plan was just approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission on September 11th of this year. The IPA has indicated that it expects the first procurement to be done in December of this year. The plan includes looking at the length of the procurement contracts and how we can manage the ZECs. The standard is in place for 10 years. It includes the pricing. There is a social cost of carbon set by law that the IPA is looking for, and there is also a cost cap, which is designed to minimize and keep energy affordable for all Illinois consumers. As already noted, the ZEC has already been subject to litigation. It is right now before the 7th Circuit. There have been challenges brought on the basis of preemption by the Federal Power Act and in violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. I think it's interesting to say that the ZEC zero emission standard represents an outgrowth that is in the same vein as the renewable portfolio standard. And a lot of discussion in Illinois was around moving towards a specific carbon goal and what would be necessary to achieve that. And as Exelon, as Bill noted, it became an issue of what would happen if the nuclear plants were to retire that were not receiving enough wholesale market energy or capacity revenues. So the ZEC includes a public interest criteria that looks at the replacement for those nuclear resources and looks at the environmental benefits that are preserved from carbon, SOx, NOx, and particulate matter. Next slide, please. Almost as soon as the ZEC was put in place, PJM reacted. The first thing here you see is the Capacity Construct and Public Policy Senior Task Force. That was designed to examine how the capacity market could be redesigned to discourage states from acting in this vein and to accommodate state preferences. The capacity, we call it capacity repricing proposals, and which are the ones that have succeeded versus the non-repricing proposals that are considered, are designed to exclude or reprice any resource that is receiving a subsidy. As you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion over whether or not that would include any resource that receives a REC or is part of a renewable portfolio standard. The Capacity Task Force has finished its work. The proposal that has been agreed on to be forwarded to the Markets and Reliability Committee at PJM for consideration by all the stakeholders and ultimately the board is a proposal from the Independent Market Monitor, which would extend the MOPR, the minimum offer price rule requirement, to those resources receiving a state subsidy. The IMM is clear in its proposal that this is not necessarily intended to include renewable portfolio standard resources. It is instead intended to affect nuclear resources that receive a zero emission credit. One of the frustrations, I think, for consumer advocates, and I certainly think for myself, has been that PJM has acted very quickly to respond to this state initiative without having the next capacity market auction in place and without seeing the effects of the zero emission standard on the market and market prices. One of the other frustrations, I think, is that as a consumer advocate, oftentimes we are looking for stability, I think, for markets to encourage the right and most efficient use of resources. And this will be, I believe, the 9th time PJM has adjusted its capacity market rules. They, this summer, then put out what they call the Achieving Zero Emissions Objectives White Paper. That is PJM's first foray into how they could administer a carbon market. It would apply to all carbon emitting suppliers on a price per ton basis and be reflected in offers. They are not have a lot of detail out yet in terms of how this would manage things like leakage or the, I guess, reaction from other states within PJM to having a carbon price. Right now, the objectives are pretty straightforward. It was simply to be a more efficient use of enabling state policies that want to limit carbon while preserving the competitive economic dispatch across the footprint. The devil is very much in the details on this, and PJM has just started this conversation. There is not a time for it as yet to be completed. And last but not least, has already been mentioned, the energy price formation, which has been now put forward by PJM. I believe it will be a formal stakeholder process after December 7th. That is going to be, I think, for consumer advocates, another challenge, and I certainly think for stakeholders within PJM, because of two things. The locational marginal price that has been put in place in PJM has been in place for a long time, and I think there are a lot of stakeholders in those sectors who have concerns about changing that. I think that there is also a concern about how all of these markets function together. So if we were to do capacity repricing, if PJM was to administer a carbon price, and if we were to change the energy market price formation rules, what the end price for end use consumers would be, and what values or attributes that price is actually compensating across all of these streams will be difficult to parse out, and I think that's a concern. One of the things that we are always asking PJM and all wholesale markets, I think, and MISO to provide is clarity on the goals, and then also to make clear that we are taking a holistic look at what kind of resource mix we are attempting to incent, and a holistic look at how the attributes we're valuing, such as flexibility, will be compensated for across all of the markets. It's certainly a challenge, I think, for the markets as well. Some of this, I think, will come down to, as Ari alluded to, the legalities of the state and wholesale market policy interaction, which we will, have to work out here in the coming months. But I think as we attempt to have states who will take a more and more aggressive role in preserving the resource mix within their state of their choice, and PJM includes not only Illinois and eastern states, but also Kentucky and West Virginia, who have, you might imagine, have very different objectives for their resource mix than we do. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how PJM continues to react to that. I think I will leave it there and look forward to a really good and lively discussion.
Thank you, Kristin. I think you bring an excellent perspective to this entire discussion. Of course, the consumer impact is an important focus on any of these policies. You touched on the issue of clarity of the goals and just transparency in the attributes that we're valuing. I think those are some really important points. So this brings us to the discussion portion of this webinar, and I've put a few questions on this slide here that I will address with the panelists, and there are many questions that are coming in, and we're keeping track of those as well, so we'll get to your question, the audience questions shortly. But I wanted to start with these questions, and we're just looking at the first one. So I think we've identified some challenges, but maybe we can just pull them out across or summarize them from the different speakers, that the RTOs in the case of PJM and the ISOs in the case of the New York example that was presented. What are the main hurdles that they're facing in trying to get this idea put forward? I'll start with Ari first, if you have some thoughts on that. I know you've talked about it from a bit from the legal perspective.
Yeah, I think I talked about the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, and the bottom-up approach I think is administratively and legally the simpler path forward for pricing carbon or any other externality in the market, but it involves the RTO itself likely through its stakeholder process, coming together on a proposal that it wants to put before FERC. So really the challenge is getting the market participants, getting the states who are not market participants but obviously have a strong interest in what happens in these markets, getting them behind the proposal, whether it's carbon as I focused on, or whether it's whatever resilience exactly might mean. But I think it's really just a political challenge, I think, more than anything else.
So you talked about two different approaches, from the top down and the bottom up. So the attention should be focused within the RTOs and the ISOs to push these policies forward?
I mean, I think if you're looking to price carbon in an RTO market, I think the bottom-up approach is the more promising path forward. I mean, we're looking at DOE's resiliency pricing NOPA right now as an example of a top-down approach, and you see how controversial that's been. And part of it is because, part of it is just is often these sort of top-down approaches are controversial, even if they're not, as sort of out of left field as DOE's NOPA is. Whenever FERC proposes something, if there are big changes to the market proposed by FERC, it generates a lot of controversy.
Yeah, yes, for sure. So, Bill, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Sure. First off, it's not a technical issue. The RTOs, they have the mechanisms today to include a price on carbon into the energy market, and they do it with RGGI. It happens every day, every 5 minutes. It's the price of RGGI is reflected into the energy dispatch. So it's certainly not a technical issue. It is, the RTOs are in an interesting position because, as was mentioned earlier, there's nothing in their tariff that says they should be addressing environmental externalities. Their tariff and their charter today is about energy, capacity, ancillary services, and that's what they do. So the RTOs themselves, I don't think are going to push for a price on carbon. It has to come from, when you're talking about it on a regional basis, it really has to come from the states. The states, to the extent they have carbon goals and would like to use the wholesale market to achieve those goals in a lower cost manner, the RTOs can certainly accommodate it. And that's why New York, in Exelon's opinion, is so interesting, because it is a single state RTO. And right now you have the RTO, the New York ISO, as well as the State Department of Public Service, both exploring this issue together. And that's really what it's going to take, is for the state and the RTO to come together and agree that putting a price on carbon helps achieve the policy objectives of not only the state, but the RTO. That, I think, is the biggest challenge that we face. Exelon did, in New England, there was an integrating markets and public policy. Exelon made it's put its best foot forward to try and convince the states that it was in their best interest to do this. And it really came down to, the states weren't comfortable going there. There were some jurisdictional concerns. If the state were to allow FERC to set this up, are the states somehow losing control over the price of carbon? Those are all very real issues, but they are political issues, as I already mentioned, not technical issues.
Thanks, Bill. So I think you've given a good segue for Sam here. Things seem to be moving full steam ahead in New York State. So what do you foresee as some potential roadblocks to New York really being a leader and moving forward and trying to implement this?
I agree that they're moving full steam ahead pursuing the idea. That does not mean they are, that everybody there, that the state, that the Public Service Commission has committed to implementing carbon pricing. We'll see. I don't have a crystal ball what will come out of the stakeholder process. I mean, I think that like Bill said, the likelihood of something working is much higher in a single state RTO, where, as Bill described, the ISO and the state regulators and state policymakers are in a pretty intensive dialogue about it now. I do want to point out, though, that even though I fully agree with what Ari said and what Bill said about how for carbon pricing to happen, it really needs to be demanded by the constituents, by the states. that they want it, that they have a carbon policy, they have carbon objectives, and they want to implement it in this way that they're not too worried about the jurisdictional things that Bill said, the possibility of customer rate. But that is that's for whether to introduce much higher carbon prices, like we've been discussing. There's an issue that PJM will have to deal with regardless, that it already has facing it, which is that there are some RGGI states within its footprint, and there are others that may join too. It will have a seam within its footprint, and with RGGI goals now being more stringent than they were before, prices being more meaningful likely in the future, still probably not higher than the teens. But it becomes very important for PJM to figure out how to address the seam within its integrated dispatch and to make sure that RGGI is not creating distortions and leakage, so economic waste and undermining the environmental goals. And I'm wondering if the states are going to push hard and RGGI will push hard to ask them to do that, which is to have some kind of a border adjustment between the states.
So, Kristin, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here as well. So do you see the same sort of path forward where the states are driving the RTOs and into perhaps implementing some kind of carbon pricing in the power markets?
Yes, I mean, I agree with the folks who said it's a political problem, not a technological problem. I think there's two things. So the stakeholder process that PJM at least uses, I think, is a great process in a lot of ways. But I do think it poses some unique challenges for trying to figure out how to do a carbon market, or for PJM to be the administrator of a carbon market. One thing to note first off is that the state commissions are not members of PJM. So the way the stakeholder process is set up, they can express a preference, but when it comes to sort of voting on and refining the problem statements that kick off every stakeholder process, the commissions usually have to use sort of the power of the pulpit and send letters or somehow work out things with the board separately. The other interesting thing is that the way the sectors are arranged and the way the stakeholder process is arranged, you get probably some challenges because at the lower levels where you're talking about the scope of the problem statement, which, as I think a lot of us who've been in group processes know can be really what drives the outcome, because you have to be very specific in the question you're answering. That is not where sector-weighted voting takes place. That is just sort of an open voting. And then the proposals at those task forces can be also voting that's open, where you can get sort of multiple affiliates voting, which can be a good thing when you are trying to advance a policy. It can also obviously be a frustrating thing. I do want to note the RGGI question, because I think that is something that's really important. PJM, I believe, has already had some conversations with the RGGI states and with the RGGI administrators to address that. Now, they've expressed a preference, as has the IMM, that obviously a RTO-wide carbon price would be the best. But I think they're realistic, and I can send around, if it isn't one of the documents that I put up. Within their white paper, they have some discussions on how to handle the leakage issue and the sort of sub-regional pricing that would need to be done. So I think there's some appetite to explore the carbon pricing here. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over time, because some of the biggest advocates for PJM to do this may have other options that they pursue, that they're going to pursue in terms of valuing that attribute. And so I'm not sure if it still has the same resonance that I think it did, say, a year ago, when people were actively trying to move PJM in this direction, and they were much more steadfast against it. Ironically, sort of now we're having a much more open conversation, which is good, but at the same time, there are other avenues for probably those loudest voices to get the same objective across.
Thanks, Kristin. So I want to make sure that we get to some audience questions. So I think I'm just going to skip ahead to the next question. Really, just focusing around the NOPR. If continuous power for customers is the objective, then is resilience, as described in the DOE NOPR, the right attribute to focus on right now? I know that there may be some strong opinions on this one. We'll kick that one off with Bill first this time.
So continuous. I mean, I think we do have a situation where the importance of electricity being available has never been greater. It's always been important, but in today's age of digital and technology, it all relies on electricity. So, the DOE NOPR, I think, adds one element to the electricity markets, and it is really this resiliency. It's how can the grid recover from something that is completely unexpected, and how quickly can it recover, and how do we prepare such that the grid is more robust. There has been continuous work for years on defining reliability and procuring reliability through a planning standard. I would call that resource adequacy. On the transmission and distribution side, NERC has passed, a lot of regulations on the wires, trying to improve threats from cybersecurity and resilience to storms like Superstorm Sandy or hurricanes. So there is a lot of work that has been done today, and we have a grid that is fairly robust. I view the DOE NOPR as it's going one step further, and it's just something that we have not considered. It is as I said, it is man-made or natural disasters. How quickly can we recover? And I think that is a fair question. It hasn't been addressed historically, and I do think we need to address it as an industry.
Thanks, Bill. Sam, do you have? I know that you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, if we're really talking about continuous power, I mean, the fact is that the vast majority of interruptions to customers come from the distribution level, not and especially with severe storms, not supply, not fuel security. I mean, there's a nice little statistic that the Rhodium Group did that showed that of all the lost customer service megawatt hours over the last many years, some sliver of a fraction of 1% came from inadequate fuel supply. So, if we're worried about continuous power, we should be having a broader discussion. Now, I do think it's a legitimate question. Are there threat scenarios that face us that we should be thinking through and planning against? That's a very good question. I was amazed by the lack of specificity in the DOE NOPR. It didn't describe any of the specifics of what we ought to be worried about. I mean, there may be some, but it didn't describe them. And I think if we're going to do anything about it, it's got to start with a clear definition of what is it that we're worried about. What do we need to design either the short-term energy markets around to make sure that we're meeting, you have the right operational signals? If necessary, do we have some sort of hopefully market-based approach like the capacity markets, an enhanced version of the capacity markets, maybe to make sure we're having certain sufficient certain types of attributes needed to meet whatever we say those very specific objectives are. But I think the DOE NOPR really jumped a lot of steps in proposing a solution without having ever even defined the problem or having thought through market-based solutions that would be least cost and compatible with our competitive RTO markets.
Thanks, Sam. Kristin, did you want to weigh in?
Quickly, I mean, I agree that I think the NOPR skipped a lot of steps. I think one of the interesting things here is that if you look at resiliency, if we're defining or discussing resiliency, and I don't think DOE really defined this, but if you talk about in terms of recovery, right, or your ability to recover, mapping that to the attributes that we're incenting, I think is probably something we can do. I think from a consumer perspective, one of the frustrations is that the political realities around not being seen either for the commissions or the RTOs or FERC, state commissions, RTOs or FERC, as standing in the way of, any sort of threat to, recovery or, at times is kind of frustrating, because what that tends to mean is that I think there's an over-procurement of capacity. There is sometimes a tendency to reward attributes that actually aren't matching up with what we want. Because when I think of resilience or recovery, there's the more flexible resources, the better. So I think like the polar vortex example in PJM, the performance of demand response, I thought was very good. That's enabled by distribution system investments in AMI and digital infrastructure for utilities. I think that is something that the DOE NOPR, I think as Sam just alluded to, didn't really address, is this interaction between the distribution, the transmission, and these other grids, to say, if this really is about recovery and your ability to respond quickly in a crisis, then there's a bigger interplay at work. And I'd also point out that I think the wholesale markets, we're talking about markets, they have other tools in the toolbox as well. So you can look at things, I'll go back to the polar vortex, the winter testing requirements, the startup times, the things that actually, and then the performance penalties for failure to perform, the alignment of gas and energy trading windows, the sort of mechanics that enable a market to work and enable a resource to perform, I think are also important for us not to lose sight of. The RTOs and ISOs can do a lot aside from simply having a market. I think markets work very well, but it's a much more holistic look that we need to have if this is going to be our goal.
Thanks, Kristin. And Ari, did you have any comments on this question?
So really quickly, I mean, I agree with everything Kristin and Sam said, and let me just, Sam mentioned a stat that the Rhodium Group put out. It's actually 0.00007% of lost customer hours is due to fuel supply emergencies. So again, DOE doesn't define what resilience means. It does mean something. It is something that we should consider, but it's hard to believe that larger piles of coal and nuclear fuel rods are the solution that we need.
Okay, I want to shift now to some of the audience questions that we've received, and the first one is a general question, so anyone on the panel feel free to jump in. So one of the audience members asks, is there clarity with these carbon pricing proposals as to how much emission reductions can be achieved? It's kind of a multi-part question. Conversely, how much certainty is there for businesses on what future energy prices they can expect, and what comes out ahead, certainty on emissions or certainty on costs? So would anyone like to pick up any part of that question?
This is Sam. I'd like to take it. I think it's a great question because this is sort of the long-standing question in environmental policy design, whether to specify the quantities and have the market determine the price, as in cap and trade. In that case, the prices are very uncertain, but the quantities may be set. And the opposite is where you set the prices, but let the market determine the quantities. That's in the case of a tax or one of these carbon adders. In that case, the quantity achieved is very uncertain. It's very hard to predict. And so this is sort of these are sort of the two approaches. Something like RGGI is actually a hybrid because it's cap and trade, but it has a collar with the ability to change the number of allowances in order to keep prices within a certain range. And I think in terms of the last part of the question, I think that sort of probably went to investability. How much can a market participant forecast prices? That's pretty tricky, actually. Even if you're administratively setting the price, I mean, there are questions of regulatory risk around it. Will future administrations somehow change those prices? So this is one of the trickier areas.
Thanks, Sam. Did anyone else have some thoughts on that? Bill, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, I like what Sam said, and I agree with it. I would tell you that the argument of prices being uncertain, it is a very real argument. But as we're talking about a carbon price, it is just one element of the total market revenues that market participants receive. We are moving towards competitive wholesale markets, and they are risky and inherent. They're just inherently risky. But you have seen investment decisions made even with that risk. And the other point I would make is when I heard the question, it almost is like how much of a carbon price do we need to get a response? And I think that does very much vary by region. And I would contrast PJM from New England. New England, I believe all their coal plants have left. They have 2 nuclear plants, renewables, and gas. So the price on carbon that you would need there to incent new renewables would be much higher than the price you would need in PJM, where there is still an abundance of coal and other resources out there that would be competing underneath the carbon price, and you would see meaningful change in PJM at a much lower price than you would see in New England. So, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I've got a question here specifically for Kristin. An audience member wants to know what role are consumer advocates taking with regard to the 2 PJM carbon and pricing proposals?
I missed a bit of that. You broke up for me for a second. Can you repeat the question?
Certainly. What role are consumer advocates taking with regard to the 2 PJM carbon and pricing proposals?
So I think the role is diverse across the offices. So we are all members of PJM. I think there's one group, one consumer advocate who is not a member, but who is an active participant in the stakeholder processes. There is the contrast between, I think, the RGGI states who are concerned about how this would affect what their consumers are already used to. I think they're interested in exploring it. My own personal opinion, I think there is probably some feeling that this would have been a very efficient way to do this, but I think then other offices have concerns that this is going to counter state policy for their offices. So it's probably worth saying a lot of consumer advocates are in fact within either their state's attorneys general's office or members of their state public service commissions. And so sometimes, I shouldn't say sometimes, they have to take into account what the overall policies are of their state, not just with respect to cost, but with things like resource preferences. So the role, I think we expect ourselves to be very active in these discussions at PJM. I think I can say that with respect to carbon pricing, almost all of the offices expressed a preference for the status quo, as such that we believe PJM should not adopt any of the repricing proposals or non-repricing proposals put forth. We'll obviously have to make a decision now that the IMN's proposal has moved forward, and every office is going to have to evaluate that on their own.
Thank you, Kristin. So we're running kind of short on time, but I think I can get off just one more question. This one's directed for Ari. I think you mentioned, Ari, that the bar that the carbon adder would legally have to cross is it would have to enhance competition. So a questioner wants to know what if it could be shown that having a carbon adder did no harm to competition or markets, or is that effectively the same thing?
So a carbon adder would have to result in just and reasonable rates. Those are the key words under the Federal Power Act. And enhancing competition is one example of how the Supreme Court has understood just and reasonable rates in the context of today's market-based regime. So that would be one avenue. If FERC were to conclude that a carbon adder were to enhance competition, it would then be just and reasonable. Another alternative is, these are not, an alternative, doesn't necessarily have to satisfy both, is that it could just be, that a carbon adder encourages the orderly development of the industry. That's another way that the Supreme Court has interpreted just and reasonable rates. So there's a couple of different ways you could look at just and reasonable. Enhancing competition is just one of them. If it literally sort of did nothing to competition, I'm not sure that it sort of kept things at a steady state. I'm not sure how FERC might conclude that. I think it would be up to whoever is advocating for a carbon tax, for a carbon adder, to make the case to FERC that it is either enhancing competition or encouraging the orderly development of the industry, to really make that affirmative case to FERC, and then I think FERC would have the evidence before it that it could then agree with that conclusion.
Great, thank you so much. So we've come to the end of our hour and a half here, but I would really like to thank our panelists today for a very informative discussion, and thanks to our audience. For those who have stayed with us for the full 90 minutes, we hope that you've gotten a lot out of today's webinar. I just want to remind everyone that the handouts are available, so if you can quickly click on the PDF files on the control panel, and that this webinar will be, it has been recorded and it will be available shortly on the C2ES YouTube page. Thank you all very much.